Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. Hot on the heels of a speech to the UN General Assembly and a historic trip to Canada, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang reached Cuba in the final stop of his tour of the Americas. And his trip to Cuba came less than a week after Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe concluded his own visit there. Is this simply good business on the part of China? How will the Premier's visit enhance economic and political ties between the two countries? And as U.S. restrictions on relations with Cuba are being lifted, will the island nation be another area of competition between the world's three largest economies? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Professor Rick Dunham, a visiting scholar at Tsinghua University, and Mr. Victor Gao Zhikai, Director of China National Association for International Studies. Also, Chilean Ambassador Hu Hin will join us on the phone. But before we begin our discussion, let's take a look at this.
Chinese Premier Li Keqiang arrived in Havana on September 24th and met the country's president, Raul Castro. This is the first visit to Cuba by a Chinese premier in more than half a century. As the only communist country in the Western Hemisphere, Cuba has long enjoyed strong ideological as well as commercial ties with China. China is Cuba's second largest trading partner. The two countries exchanged $2.2 billion worth of goods in 2015, up nearly 60%. Machinery, steel and automobiles are major Chinese exports. Cuban shipments include agriculture produce and commodities. During his visit, Premier Li and President Castro took part in the signing of nearly 30 deals, covering areas such as investment, technology and environmental protection.
For our country, this offers a possibility of income and an ability to contribute to Cuba's development and to the health of both the Chinese and Cuban people.
This cooperation between Cuba and China in biotechnology has been there for over a decade. Now this opens up much greater potential.
Cuba is a relatively untapped market which Chinese entrepreneurs hope can provide new opportunities before the Americans get there. And earlier this year saw the first flights from Beijing to Havana via Canada. Cuba may have restored diplomatic relations with its old enemy, the United States, but its relationship with China remains as committed as ever. Chinese President Xi Jinping went there in 2014, while Cuba's current president and the island's former leader, Fidel Castro, have both made state visits to Beijing.
The Cuban government has defined it as the most important strategic partner of Cuba. And it has to do not only with the economics of the economic relationship is very intense, but because the political aspect of the relationship is very important.
Premier Li's final official engagement of the trip is a gala show at Havana's Grand Theatre. He'll return to China having further strengthened what is already a close relationship.
Welcome back, gentlemen. I was a little bit surprised by the background report that we watched just now because it carries some elements of ideology about Cuba. It says it's the last communist country. However, from your observation, Victor, do you think what we do and our presence in the Americas, I mean the place of Americas, has anything to do with ideology in the wake of the Cold War?
I don't think so. Calling Cuba as a communist country is a little bit too far-fetched. Cuba is indeed a socialist country with a very unique political system. Between China and Cuba, ever since 1960, when the two countries established diplomatic relations, China and Cuba have always been steadfast friends and partners, and there has been little difference between the two countries on almost all the major international issues. That's the commonality of interest between China and Cuba. And ever since China started to reform and opening to the outside world, China-Cuba relations have been mostly based on economic and trading interests.
Are you suggesting clearly that China is aware of the Monroe Doctrine? It was a long time ago, but China is pretty wary and pretty watchful about what the Americans do care. I mean, the US cares. So what do you think of the Chinese vigilance and our very extreme care about not crossing the red line, quote unquote, of the US government in their backyard?
Well, first, it's clear China, Cuba are among the last communist nations in the world from political system. North Korea Vietnam, very few others. So there is that commonality. But yes, China is not in Cuba for political reasons. This is not the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is not Khrushchev. China is there because it is a long-time ally and because of the economic ties. Economic ties that go as deep as oil and biotechnology. It's existing ties and future ties because Cuba is opening up. The economy of Cuba is opening up to more of a market system and more internationalism. And so infrastructure is a big thing that China could get, and technology, the new economy of China.
So China invests not in the nuclear warheads in the backyard of the United States, like what happened in 1962, the missile crisis between the former Soviet Union and the United States. In what areas do you think the two economies would enhance their cooperation?
Between China and Cuba?
Between Cuba and China.
Yeah, between China and Cuba, the cooperation can be very extensive. Right now, I think one area, for example, is the public health and medical sector, which Cuba really excels, even though it is considered as an emerging economy. Its experience in the public health sector can actually offer many lessons for China. And I would say that between China and Cuba, this is one area where cooperation potential can be very much expanded in the years to come. And I think China can import the expertise, the way they run their system, the public health system, as well as the drug system, for example, and the training of doctors and nurses in Cuba. Tourism is another very bright spot right now because there is no direct flight between China and Cuba. Tourism from China to Cuba is actually limited, but going forward, there will be huge potential in this regard.
Well, thank you very much. Let me get over to Ambassador Jorge for his comments on the implications of Premier Li Keqiang's official visit to Havana 2 years after President Xi Jinping paid an official visit to that country, which had been isolated by the United States for over half a century. Hi, Ambassador Jorge.
Good to talk to you.
Right. Do you think our relationship with Cuba may trigger the opening up of that government, like what we went through in the late 1970s and through much of the 1980s, so that Cubans could learn from China in, for example, setting up the special economic zones, in attracting overseas investment, and to have joint ventures, etc., so that it becomes an acceptable economy?
Yes, well, let me say the following. It seems to me that what we are seeing in Cuba is a very significant change ever since the opening up with the United States and the visit of President Obama. We have seen a number of major changes since then. And it seems to me that the visit of Prime Minister Li Keqiang and the strengthening of ties with China is another step in that direction. I know very well that for Cuba, links with China are extremely significant, and no doubt they will be strengthened further now, and the Cuban economy will continue to open up as it has already been doing. But I would like to underscore beyond the issue of Cuba how significant relations between China and Latin America have become over the past decade and a half or so, and that how the visit of Prime Minister Li Keqiang, who last year visited Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, falls into that pattern. Nowadays, China is the #1 trading partner for Brazil, Chile, and Peru, the #2 trading partner for a number of significant other countries, including Cuba, Venezuela, Argentina. So what we have seen in the course of the current century, actually, is a major shift in the insertion of Latin America into the international political economy, in which its ties with Asia, and particularly with China, has come to play a key role.
A few days ago, yet another major conference of the non-aligned movement took place in one small island of Venezuela. Do you view the current visit by Premier Li Keqiang to Cuba as yet another serious effort by one of the players of the Americas to keep a distance from the United States, which has taken Latin America somehow as its traditional backyard with the end of the Cold War, nonetheless, that took place in the year 1991.
Yes. Well, I really wouldn't put it that way. Quite the contrary. It seems to me is what we are seeing in the case of China's enhanced presence in Latin America is that it is very much a win-win proposition. That is, everybody benefits. The fact that Latin American countries are able to diversify their trade and investment links by doing more trade and investment with countries like China, by now the second largest economy in the world, means that there are more development opportunities, the countries can move forward, they can develop more their industry, their agriculture. And in that sense, I wouldn't really see it as a sort of zero-sum competition between the major powers, but rather something in which everybody benefits.
Thank you very much. That's what we call co-prosperity and shared economy in the promising continent of Latin America. Welcome back. Let's go back to what happened in Canada, where 10 years after alienation and indifferences between the two governments, are we able to say goodbye to what was called diplomacy of principles by or under the leadership of the Harper administration later?
Well, I would say the Harper administration before Prime Minister Trudeau was characterized with, as you mentioned, indifference to China, and this was actually to the detriment of Canadian interest. And Harper actually even went as far as boycotting the Beijing Olympics. He did not, come to Beijing to cheer for the Canadian teams, whereas the sitting U.S. President George W. Bush came not only by himself, but he brought a whole bunch of Bushes to Beijing and stayed here for up to about a week. So in that sense, former Prime Minister Harper went even further than former President Bush in the United States, and that's really not very meaningful or significant. I think Prime Minister Trudeau has demonstrated leadership and courage and vision in terms of steering China-Canadian relations in a new direction so that the Canadian national interests will be protected and will benefit from closer economic and trade ties with China. After all, China is the second largest economy in the world, whereas the United States is achieving very fast energy independence. They no longer need that much energy from Canada. So the Canadian destination is really to find countries like China, or even to a smaller extent Japan, South Korea, as the destination of the energies to be produced in Canada. That's the destiny of China and Canada working together in the future.
Well, Rick, despite the ideological overtones that characterized the diplomacy between Canada and China during the Harper administration in a pretty bad way, let's be fair. What do you think of the impact of repatriating the most notorious economic fugitive, Mr. Lai Chang-hsing, successfully during the Harper administration? Of course, on condition that that guy, Lai Chang-hsing, would not be sentenced to the death penalty, despite the horrific economic crimes in the trafficking scandals. I mean, what do you think of the silver lining that may have laid the groundwork for a serious improvement of the bilateral relationship during the visit by Premier Li Keqiang to Canada?
It is true, but you can't deny under Prime Minister Harper there were rough relations. He talked a lot about human rights. He talked a lot about the differences between the nations. That was a turning point with the return of the most wanted fugitive, and it was necessary for China to overcome the other issues. But think of Prime Minister Trudeau, and back to his father, who built ties with China at a time when the United States had no relationship with China. And he sees this much more in economic terms as something that could benefit Canada as well as China, rather than something in geopolitical terms like Harper did.
Thank you very much. You're watching Dialogue with Victor Gao and Rick Dunham. We're discussing the messages that Premier Li Keqiang delivered through his trip to the United Nations, Canada and Cuba. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us. Welcome back. We were talking about the repatriation of Mr. Lai Changxing, the most notorious fugitive during the Harper administration. Now, one agreement that was reached between Premier Li Keqiang and his Canadian counterpart, Justin Trudeau, was one about sharing and return of forfeited assets. This is China's first special agreement on asset recovery. What do you make of this?
Well, I think between China and Canada, for the two governments to talk about signing an extradition treaty is absolutely necessary. Canada, for all its claims as a democracy and caring for human rights, should not turn itself as a haven for criminals, including economic fugitives. And in China, over the past several years, there have been this very dangerous trends for economic fugitives to flee to Canada with their assets in the hope that they can stay there and get away from justice in China. And I think that's the wrong thing. And I think what the Canadian government is working with China will put an end to that false hope by the criminals. Likewise, if there are any fugitives from Canada fleeing to China, the Chinese government need to do the same thing. And this will make sure that neither country, either China or Canada, will be seized up by ideological considerations and turn itself as a haven for the criminals of the other side. Justice needs to be served for these criminals.
In your observation, Rick, why does a Western democracy such as Canada have to share the dirty money in what is called the return of forfeited assets by the economic fugitives from China?
Well, I think traditionally there is a share of the forfeiture of assets that goes to the country that turns back the fugitives. You can debate whether that is fair or not, whether it is whether there's a share of the dirty money or whether it is to help them repay the costs of the law enforcement. I mean, I could see an argument for a small case, but I think the bigger point here is that this is an important agreement for China, and Canada had become a haven because there was not an agreement like this. It was even safer than going to the United States for corrupt Chinese officials. And so I think this is important for the Chinese justice system to have this agreement in place.
Thank you very much. The trip also took Premier Li Keqiang in the first place to the United Nations. He attended the General Assembly there on behalf of the Chinese government. Now, we have been discussing the implications of his policy speeches at the United Nations General Assembly on the issue of refugee crisis, for example, and sustainability for developing countries. Let's take yet another look of what Shinzo Abe did. This guy called for reforms of the United Nations, and in just before Premier Li Keqiang went to Havana, the trip also took Shinzo Abe to Havana for a similar visit. Now, what does the Japanese government want to achieve?
Well, as far as the Japanese proposal to reform the United Nations, and by the Japanese definition, they want to become a permanent member state of the Security Council. That's exactly what Japan is driving at. From the Chinese perspective, Japan needs to first come clean of their wartime legacies.
Wait a minute, Rick, let me ask
Japan
you real quickly.
Really make a firm position
I see your
on
point.
the Second World War crimes. Otherwise, China will never agree to the Japanese version of the reform of the United Nations.
Yes, China has good and legitimate reasons to be obsessively concerned about the historic outlook of the Japanese government with regard to their apology. Now, Rick, from your perspective, do you think Shinzo Abe and his government will become a serious political power with a serious political clout, since it fails to get fully integrated with the region? For example, Northeast Asia, with ROK and the PRC both demand complete apology, sincere and complete apology from the Japanese government about either the issue of comfort women or Yasukuni Shrine.
Well, first, Japan sees itself as deserving of a seat on the Security Council because it is the world's third largest economy, and the two largest are on the Security Council, and others that are smaller are on the Security Council. So that's the case. That's the case that Japan would make. However, China can veto, and it's not going to happen until and unless Japan does these things that you and Victor have talked about, to whether it is apologies, taking responsibility for wartime action, or becoming more involved in some of these multinational issues in Northeast China, Northeast Asia.
Some American scholars have done a serious policy report about China's economic presence in Africa. And they say China only contributed about 5% to the overseas contributions there. I'm not sure about the accuracy of the figures that they came up with. However, it seems the Japanese government has been also very concerned about their business presence in Africa. Is that a serious effort to woo the support from African League in their support of the reform of the UN Security Council, in the hope that Japan could be elected one day a permanent member of the UN Security Council?
Short answer is yes. There are political reasons and there are economic reasons. Japan and China both see Africa as an emerging market and a huge potential market. And I say that ties it back into this trip in Cuba. Both of them see Cuba as a tremendous economic opportunity. For Japan, in Africa and in Cuba, I think the main challenges are political more than the economic competition head-to-head with China.
Do you think the U.S. is ready to reform the UN Security Council by, for example, enhancing representation of Asia? Because we have already got one permanent member from Asia, the PRC there.
Well, the reform of the United Nations, especially the Security Council composition, will be a very complicated one, and it will really require all the wisdom and good wishes of all the member states, especially the 5 permanent member states of the Security Council. Each permanent member can veto any reform program for the United Nations, especially the Security Council composition. And that's why, for example, when Japan really wants to become a permanent member state of the Security Council, it really needs to deal with these facts or these matters head on. It cannot just ignore the importance of China, because otherwise it's hitting its head against a very, very solid stone wall. China will stand in the way of any Japanese attempt to become a permanent member state of the Security Council. That's the bottom line, unless Japan really changes its own mentality towards the legacy of the Second World War. I would urge Prime Minister Abe to rethink his strategy of becoming a permanent member state of the Security Council. If, for example, it can change its attitude in China-Japan relations, for example, then Japan may actually have a better chance.
Here is yet another perspective in examining the Japanese application for permanent membership at the UN Security Council. A few years ago, a Chinese diplomat was pouring scorns on the Japanese understanding of their representation at the UN Security Council. We accused the Japanese of using their contributions to the membership fees as if this is a board of directors. The more you contribute, the stronger voice you're going to deliver. China says, no, that's not that simple. What do you think of the Chinese concern?
Well, it's true. It's not that simple. But it is also true at the United Nations, the countries that give the most money do have clout. However, that doesn't extend to Security Council membership. You cannot buy Security Council membership. There has to be a consensus built, which means that China has to be in on it or it's not going to happen.
And I believe Prime Minister Modi from India may also submit its legitimate application for representing Asia. After all, it's the most populous democracy in the world.
Well, yes, indeed, but Japan needs to fully recognize the fact that the United Nations organization itself was established, including the Security Council of the United Nations, was established for the purpose of avoiding a repetition of the Second World War and to completely disarm Japan and Germany for any attempt to launch another war of aggression against any other country. Therefore, I think Prime Minister Abe really needs to wake up to the realities of history as well as realities of contemporary international situation today before he is wasting all the resources of Japan on this futile attempt to become a permanent member state of the Security Council. If it does not square off with other permanent member states, including China.
But I'm afraid reform of the UN Security Council is, among all others, one of the issues to be addressed seriously over 7 decades after the Second World War. For example, every sign seems to point to a strong indicator that we need to seriously improve the existing world economic and political order, which was based on what was agreed upon in the wake of the Second World War. For example, the Bretton Woods for the financial structure, IMF and the World Bank, to say nothing of the representation at the UN Security Council. So do you think, can you understand that emerging markets in particular have delivered their legitimate grievances and concerns about the necessity of reforming the United Nations?
And I think that's correct. I mean, we have to separate this issue of Japan getting a permanent spot on the Security Council from how we reconstruct the post-Second World War world to reflect the realities of the 21st century. I mean, I see the case being made persuasively that Asia deserves more representation on the Security Council, and that could be part of a compromise that would be generally acceptable. But again, you are not going to have the second nation being Japan or the second nation being India without consensus. India could say, yes, we are the most populous democracy in the world, but Pakistan is going to say, no way.
But we are able to recruit India and Pakistan with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization so that we can conduct a dialogue on equal footing between these two arch rivals in South Asia. Let's go back to yet another serious issue on the world order. Now, what concerns the US most with the rise of China is whether Beijing has the intent to seriously challenge the primacy of the United States, which has been regarded as the architect of the post-war security scenario the world over.
From the Chinese perspective, the world is so big that it can more than accommodate both the United States and China, even though China's rise is a fact. And sooner or later, and I would say sooner rather than later, the overall size of the Chinese economy in all respects probably will be larger than the United States.
Except for per capita.
Yeah, China is already
soft power.
Yeah, China is already larger than the United States in many, many areas. And the United States need to live with the fact that eventually they need to deal with China much larger than the United States. I would have already come up with a brief estimation at the peak of the Chinese economic development. The total size of the Chinese GDP probably will be twice as big as that of the United States. That's a mega trend that the US need to live up with in the future.
Yes, indeed. At least China is badly needed in the area of climate change. Without China, nothing would be found to help fix the problem. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.